Good evening friends, you are most welcome to Think Ice channel. Today we are going to discuss social anthropology by IGNOU mane004. Here we will discuss gender and society and our topic is gender ideology. Let us begin the topic. According to Andre Bitelli 2000, an ideology is that set of ideas and beliefs which seek to articulate the basic values of group of people, what they cherish for themselves and for others, to the distribution of power in society. An ideology is not a systematic theory, although it has systematic properties and it often strives to be a theory. It may or may not succeed in articulating basic values to the distribution of power, but such articulation is part of its purpose and design. Greet in 1996 describes gender ideologies as how a person identifies herself and himself with regard to martial and family roles that are traditionally linked to gender. In other words, gender ideology may refer to the value of distinctive roles, rights, and tasks for men and women in their respective society. Sometimes it deals with the prevailing legitimate gender inequality based on caste, class, tribe, and the like. In view of Andre Bitelli's idea on ideology, it can be argued that gender ideology is also a part of beliefs that sustain gender stratification. The noted feminist and anthropologist Shari Ortner 1996 pointed out the intricacies of gender ideology in her work in Nepal among the Sherpas. She opined that in every society, women are viewed as closer to nature, whereas men are identified with culture, a prejudice that she blames for the universal second class status of women. She also examined at men's obsession with female chastity and their systematic control of women's social and sexual behavior in traditional societies. She maintains that this ideology was bound up with the emergence of patriarchal extended families, social hierarchies, and the state. Gender stratification. Rush Long 2012 opened that gender stratification cuts across all aspects of social life, cuts across all social classes, and refers to men and women's unequal access of power, prestige, and property on the basis of their sex. To be more precise, through the process of socialization, individuals encompass gender into their personalities or gender identities and gender roles. In the context of patriarchal Indian society, men are given more power and resources as compared to women. Therefore, gender becomes an important dimension of social stratification. With regard to resource distribution among the matrilineal society, a system in which descent is traced through the mother's line or maternal ancestor, an individual belongs to one's mother's lineage and the children or offspring would inherit immovable or movable property, that titles or surnames from their maternal lineage. In India, the Garo and Khasi tribes in Meghalaya, the Muslim tribe of the Kalpeni in Lakshadweep, and the Nayars of Kerala are matrilineal societies, although the Nayars have gradually transformed themselves into patrilineal society at present. Here, gender is a crucial factor of social stratification even in matrilineal societies. Gender stratification may be analyzed from a structural functional paradigm. The structural functional paradigm is a theoretical framework that perceives society as a complex system whose parts work together to advance solidarity and stability. The major insight of the structural functional paradigm is that gender functions to organize social life as emphasized by sociologist Talcott Parsons. Massionis J. John argued that gender implies more than how people think and act. It is about social hierarchy. The reality of gender stratification can be seen first in the world of work. Gender identity. Gender identity is defined as an individual's perception of oneself as male or female or third gender, and it also deals with how society views you. This concept is closely related to the concept of gender role that reflects gender identity. Madhu Kishwar, 1996, in her article, Who Am I? Living Identities versus Acquired Ones, argued that she became conscious of her identity as a woman only on those few occasions when she was discriminated against on account of her gender, for example, when facing sexual harassment or biasness in employment. Otherwise, her gender identity is only one of her multiple overlapping and cross cutting identities which peacefully coexist with other identities. From a sociological perspective, gender identity involves all the meanings that are applied to oneself on the basis of one's gender identification. In turn, these self meanings are a source of motivation for gender related behavior. Burke, 1980. Sometimes gender identity is imposed on individuals by society. Gender identity is also self identified as a result of a combination of inherent and extrinsic or environmental factors. Gender role, on the other hand, is manifested within society by observable factors such as behavior and appearance. This formation of gender identity is a multifaceted process that commences with conception, and it involves processes during gestation and even learning experiences after birth. In some societies, the traditional norms insist that everyone be classified either as a man or a woman. When the gender identity of an individual makes her a woman, although her genitals are males, she may experience what is known as dysphoria, that means a profound depression caused by experience of herself as a woman after her lack of phallus and her lack of phallus. Gender role is normally an external expression of gender identity. Majority of people believed that gender identity and gender role are in accord. Sometimes cultural differences proliferate in the expression of one's gender role, but in some other societies such fine distinction is accepted since gender norms can play a part in describing gender identity. Gender division of labor. It is the consequence of how a particular society divides work among men and women according to what is considered appropriate to each gender. Gender stereotype. Gender stereotype are one-sided and exaggerated image of men and women which are deployed repeatedly in everyday lives. Stereotyping is a process by which children are socialized into sex roles and by which adults and children are denied opportunities for more individually varied development. Marshall, 1994. Gender stereotype is the assignment of roles, tasks, and responsibilities to a particular gender on the basis of preconceived prejudices. It is also the assumption made about a particular gender that may be positive or negative. Often, we observe that gender stereotyping is based on past speculations, although it may not be true. Gender stereotype barely convey truthful information about other people. Alternatively, gender stereotype is a basic overview about the gender characteristics, disparities, and roles of individuals and groups. Whenever people apply gender assumptions to others, they are propagating gender stereotyping. Gender stereotyping often reveals conventionally simplified visuals concerning the standard social roles of men and women. Some of the stereotype of men and women are: men are not sensitive, women are not great drivers, and women love nagging and gossiping. Gender stereotypes are beliefs held about characteristics and activity domains that are considered being appropriate for men and women. A typical characteristics of traditional Indian women are submissiveness, piousness, obedience, and passiveness. In other words, a traditional Indian woman's role is to be in charge of domestic chores like serving her husband, looking after her children, cooking and cleaning. Such women were appreciated as virtuous ideal Indian women. In India, our culture upholds that respectable women are sensitive, caring, dresses decently, and speak softly, which are considered as core values to make women more feminine or more feminine. On the other hand, power and authority are traits commonly held by Indian men. The men are perceived to dominate the activities related to economics. The economy mode largely determines the social position of men and women, wherein men are the center of family and society, whereas women are a part of property of men. Such type of gender stereotype creates a negative impact on women's lives. Nevertheless, it is a fact that gender stereotypes are dynamic and not static. It is influenced by the ideology and economic situation of a particular era. Both men and women carry out their responsibilities according to the division of the innate characteristics of gender. Gender stereotypes are reflected in marriage, family, and community. Activity: what is gender inequality? Find out how does gender inequality come into play in educational institutions, in the classrooms, selection of courses, and administration. Femininity and masculinity meanings. Femininity is a quality of being feminine, whereas masculinity is a mainly characteristics that distinctively describes men and boys. The terms masculinity and femininity are gender categorization, whereas male and female are sex categorization. Both femininity and masculinity are rooted in the social rather than the biological. Jan E. Stats and Peter J. Burke pointed out that societal members decide what being male or female means. Example: dominant and passive, dominant or passive, brave or emotional. And males will generally respond by defining themselves as masculine, while females will generally define themselves as feminine. Because these are social definitions, however, it is possible for one to be female and see herself as masculine, or male and see himself as feminine. In India, the main driving forces of socialization, such as family, kinship, community, peer groups, schools, print and electronic media, and the like, strengthens the cultural definitions of what is feminine and masculine. Leela Dubey, 2001, made a distinction between the ideas of femininity from the concept of femininity, that is, the characteristics of women's identity at a structural level, in which she saw it as a continuous process in women's lives. She argued that these processes have effect in the existing space between biological truth and kinship relationships. In her argument, women are perceived as upholders of kinship who also determine the relationship between genders. Dubé focuses on the patrilineal, patrilocal descent pattern of the Gond tribe while studying their kinship structure that determines the rule of descent and the sharing of property and resources. Margaret Mead was one of the first to empirically ground the distinction between the biological and social characteristics of men and women. She did this rather dramatically through her study of the conception of masculinity and femininity among the Arapish, Mundugamar, and Tikambuli, three non-Western societies in the New Guinea Islands, mid 1935. She found that among the Arapish, both males and females displayed a feminine temperament, passive, cooperative, and expressive. Among the Mudugamar, both males and females displayed a masculine temperament, active, competitive, and instrumental. And among the Tikambuli, men and women displayed temperaments that were different from each other and opposite to the Western pattern. In that society, men were emotional and expressive while women were active and instrumental. Mead's study caused people to rethink the character of femininity and masculinity. It becomes obvious that different gender related traits, temperaments, roles, and identities could no longer be inextricably tied to biological sex. On the basis of this study, Mead argues that the Western equation between masculinity and aggression on the one hand and femininity and nurturation, nurturance on the other is but one among a number of possible permutations of characteristics which have no intrinsic relation with biological sex. On the basis of this study, Mead argues that the Western equation between masculinity and aggression on the one hand and femininity and nurturance on the other is but one among a number of possible permutations of characteristics which have no intrinsic relation with biological sex. Origin of the terms femininity and masculinity. Today, the psychoanalytical studies of gender identity have attempted to understand the origin and relationships of femininity and masculinity. The origin of the terms femininity and masculinity emerges after Sigmund Freud 1962 formulated his theory of sexuality based on the anatomy of men and women. Sigmund Freud showed interest in the discourse of femininity and masculinity during the late 1870s, in which he attempted to examine this issue from the bisexual and psychosexual development perspectives. His works in three essays on the theory of sexuality 1962 and his article Feminine Sexuality 1931 espouse the idea of a bisexuality that involves in every human being a more or less harmonious synthesis of feminine and masculine characteristics. According to Freud, the antagonism of femininity and masculinity go before the other pairs of opposites like active and passive, phallic and castrated, which paved the way for it. He also opened that femininity emerges after the reorganization of the psyche at the time of puberty. The antagonism between femininity and masculinity tends to be hedged in view of the fact that both sexes are amalgamated in the similar rejection of a femininity that is equated with being deprived of the phallus. He was not entirely at ease in his approach to the questions of femininity, sexuality, and bisexuality. His critics pointed out his limitations in this area, particularly with regard to his equation of femininity with passivity. Next heading is dichotomy of femininity and masculinity. The term dichotomy has become a critical query in contemporary epistemological debates. The meaning of the dichotomy deals with a division or contrast between two things that are or are represented as being opposed or entirely different. Oxford Dictionary Online 2011. It can be perceived as dualism, which categorizes how we believe. Our dichotomy presumes a belief in the reality of dual contradictory principle in every aspect. In this method, dichotomy operates hierarchical intention by defining what is normal and abnormal, what is evil and good, what is excluded and included. The dichotomy of femininity and masculinity becomes critical in contemporary society. In our everyday lives, people would expect us to act, behave, and live according to our specific gender. Many people are not able to live up to standards that are set for women and men. Often, parents in India would advise their children to behave according to their gender. For instance, girls are taught to be coy, sober, sensitive, soft spoken, and submissive, whereas boys are encouraged to be aggressive, dominant, and tough. Masculinity is manifested in being strong and tough, whereas being weak and soft are associated with femininity. It is not possible to call these Indian cultural phenomena natural. From the moment a child is born in our family, questions would be raised whether the baby is a boy or a girl, and the cultural expectations are formed around the children based on gender. Conscious and unconscious motives of having a family legacy continue through the boy bring delight. Toys like cars, lions, guns, and elephants are bought for him, preferably blue and never pink, as it is categorized with masculinity. When a boy grows up, he would be taught to act brave, valiant, and not cry like a girl. He is trained to suppress his emotion as he is told it is feminine to express it. He is encouraged to pursue sports, manage finance, drive, involved in decision making, but discouraged from domestic chores. He has fewer restrictions while going out owing to his masculinity, which also defines his primary role as breadwinner. On the other hand, if a girl is delivered, her room is maybe decorated with the supposed feminine color pink and dolls are purchased for her. The infants do not care concerning their identity being associated with colors. They are not even conscious of the significance of pink or blue colors, which people link with femininity and masculinity. In India, a girl child is often considered inferior to a boy child. The, the thought of giving her away and saving for her dowry and marriage expenses may bring misery for her parents. She would be encouraged to learn cooking, dancing, singing, housekeeping, and the like, and she may have restrictions on going out. Her gender would define her role and functions at home as sister, aunt, wife, mother, and homemaker. Activity are masculinity and femininity related to prejudice? If your answer is yes, to what kinds of prejudice are they related? Gender gap, unfair differences in the situation or access to service of men and women. These may result from religious prejudice, traditional practices, social assumptions, myths, and taboos, among the others. Our next heading is relation, significance, and contribution of femininity and masculinity on religion, sexuality and culture in India. Here the question arises as to how does religion affect femininity and masculinity? Why will religious beliefs, practices, or organization reflect or deviate from dominant patterns of gender inequality? To what extent will religious influences affect gender inequality? It is evident that religion, culture, and tradition in India are commonly used to justify women's inferior position in the society. The main religious texts have been interpreted to strengthen the power of man in our society. Gonsulin 2005 asserts that women's usefulness have been defined from a male's perspective. This is explicitly witnessed in Hinduism. There is an intrinsic link of femininity and masculinity in which the notion of goddess as Devi represents the female characteristics of the divine being among the Hindus. The concept of Shakti power symbolizes the divine feminine creative power and also signifies the sacred force that moves through the entire cosmos and the agent of change. Shakti indicates the feminine counterpart without whom the masculine characteristics, which represents consciousness or discrimination, remains powerless and negated. Shakti is also known as Prakriti, being the feminine manifestation of Brahma, who is the supreme god, of wisdom by which the universe exists and functions. The comprehensive force known as Yoni in Hinduism is feminine in nature, with motivation being the life force of creation. Disputably, Hinduism celebrates femininity and masculinity in distinctive dimensions. Traditionally, the subject matter of sexuality is a taboo in the public domain. However, it is remarkable to mention that the ancient Hindu sculptures and idols positioned in various temples across the country, including the historic Ajanta and Ellora caves, reveals the sexuality, femininity, and masculinity associated with gods, goddesses, and religion. The specific carvings and wide ranging designs covering several temples show deities in almost every sexual position that you can imagine. Such portrayals of sexuality may be appealing for some people, but if we understand Hinduism, the display illustrates an Indian conventional way of thinking about sexuality. In our country, God and goddesses have always been seen to embrace diverse kinds of sexuality, and the physical connection between two beings is perceived as a means to attain spirituality, nirvana. The center of attention in Hinduism is not on whether the sexual participants are biologically the same or different to each other. Interestingly, transgendered gods can be traced in Hinduism too. It becomes clear that gender is socially constructed and that sexualities have been displayed in India through its religion for many centuries. The division between femininity and masculinity represents the Indian traditional model where differences between genders are often exaggerated. Both genders, men and women, are biologically determined and unchangeable, wherein they are distinct with separate spheres of influence and qualities. Hence, the discourse on transgender, gays, and lesbians are not accepted at ease in India. At the same time, masculinity is more highly valued in our culture, and it is expressed through certain characteristics like chivalry, power, courage, boldness, achievement, invention, and poise, which are perceived as being inherent to them. These qualities have been acknowledged as masculine in biological as well as psychological, physiological aspect. It is perceived that the contribution of femininity and masculinity are different, but it should be valued in the same way. It is important to point out that the Hindu masculine cultural values refer to the spirit of struggle, wealth, competition, goal, power, and authority. Intriguingly, the feminine cultures give emphasis to additional value on relationships between people and attributes of life. On the other hand, the masculine cultures highlights the differences between gender roles, which are more dramatic as compared with the feminine cultures, wherein men and women possess similar values, emphasizing compassion and humility. It allows us to reflect and perceive new ideas of gender, sexuality, and religion. India stands for unity in diversity, wherein every ethnic group and caste is different from each other, but we tend to believe that deep inside all people are the same, especially when the question of sexuality arises. In the sense, we tend to minimize cultural differences with regard to sexuality. In order to be able to understand and gain esteem with regard to cross cultural relationships between different caste, class, ethnic groups, tribes, and communities, we need to create massive awareness of the diverse cultural differences. At the last, we will discuss summary. Let us begin this. Femininity and masculinity have been the central representation for understanding gender. Femininity and masculinity signifies the social outcomes of being female or male and their respective characteristics. Some feminists assert the biological differences get heightened through social descriptions of femininity and masculinity, as Judith Butler opened any theorization about gender introduces the idea of performance of gender in terms of masculinity and femininity. Therefore, performance of gender becomes instinctive as gender gets internalized through the socialization process within the dominant discourse of patriarchy. Gender is performed at different levels within the family, kinship, class, tribe, and caste. We socially enter into our gendered categories of femininity and masculinity from the day we are born. Today's social categorization of femininity and masculinity are blurring. There, there is a constant shift in the conceptualization of the men and women as controlled by complete biological or social forces. Thank you very much. These are the references, and our next topic is patriarchy and male dominance. Thank you.